afternoon. At the tone, Pacific Daylight Time will be 5, 4, and 30 seconds.
What? Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. Can you feel that? Yes, I sure can. Okay, this is interesting. There go the lights. Oh.
What were you doing during the earthquake?
Because I was a sales rep, I was visiting a store, I think it was a JCPenney store actually, in South San Jose. And I remember I was sitting in the buyer's office and actually no, that was the appointment beforehand. I went to a store where they were selling wreath supplies and it was in a strip mall. And this family owned the store, so an entire wall of the store was windows with some walls intermixed with it, and they had all the wreath supplies up on the wall. So I was calling on them to sell them things they could have in the store. And we were standing there and things started to move. And the owners of the shop ran to the door, which was completely windowed. And their daughter, who was there at the time, she was a teenager, she just started yelling, "Oh my God, oh my God." And I thought, where's the doorway to duck and cover? Because that's where I go. I don't go to the glass door. So they had actually sort of built this office in the back. So there was this little doorway. So I took the daughter and shielded her because she was freaking out. And then we waited and it ended. And stuff fell off the walls, but, and it was long. And I had been in other earthquakes. I'd been in the Whittier earthquake. I was in Santa Barbara for that one, which was also exciting, but I wasn't in Whittier, so not as exciting. So I thought, okay, well, this appointment's probably over. And the funny thing was I looked across the parking lot and there was one of those bars, that has no windows. And people are coming out because they'd all been having a good time and now they're out in the parking lot kind of staring up, and it was, anyway. So I thought, well, I'll go to my next appointment, check in with them and see how it goes. So I did. I drove to a Hallmark store, and when I arrived, they were locking up the store because the owner wasn't there, and the young ladies that worked there said that everything had fallen down and was broken and glass and whatever. And then I realized, the street lights and the stop sign lights were not working. So I made sure they were okay, and then I thought, well, I should probably go home. We had just moved to Watsonville 4 days earlier, and I figured my husband was be coming home from Moss Landing Marine Labs, and we, needed to make sure we'd get together. So I thought, well, Highway 17 will probably be really busy because of this earthquake, which I thought was in the East Bay or something. So I just thought, I'll take Hecker Pass. It'll be fine, won't be as much traffic. So I just started driving, and I couldn't find any radio stations. KGO was sort of my go-to AM station. It was not on. There was another station, I think it was at 710, I don't remember what it was. I think they had been reporting the World Series, but now it was all earthquake news, and it was really the only channel station I could get. So I started listening to it as I drove south, and so the more I heard, the more I realized I should slow down, because I was on Interstate 101 pretty much alone.
Oh.
And I thought, oh, if one of these overpasses has fallen, I could just be dead because of what happened to the Bay Bridge and the freeway in Oakland and
So you
San
knew
Francisco.
from the radio that the Bay Bridge had partially
and that's
collapsed.
when I learned the enormity of the earthquake. And of course, we all thought, oh, it's in San Francisco because everything was up there. There was no mention of where it was. And so I thought, well, I'll stop in Gilroy and call my family out of the area, because that's what you're supposed to do first, because of course we had no cell phones back then. And I started to drive 152 towards Watsonville and Gilroy, and the power was out in Gilroy, so I couldn't stop. And I thought, well, I'll just get home and call them from there. It should be fine. And So at this point, it was now almost sunset. And so as I drove Hecker Pass, I kind of ended up in a group of cars, or about 4 cars in this little sort of set of cars. And as we ascended, the roads were starting to crack. And we started driving over cracks in the road. Not anything big, just, little along the way. And then when we reached the summit, we could see down into Watsonville, and the sun had just set maybe a half hour earlier, so it was still light enough. And there was a fire. I could see a fire in Watsonville and no lights on anywhere. So then we descended, and as we did, the cracks, increased. There were lots of cracks. I later counted them 175, because that was the only way I could go to work after the earthquake. So, what are you going to do when you're driving over? It's like, well, after they patched them, of course. And then the ground started to come down on the sides of the road. So there was a lot of landslide stuff. And then there was this one section where it had completely crossed the road. We had to drive over it. And it wasn't up and over, but it was definitely, okay, we're just going to keep going, because nobody could really stop. And then as you get sort of further down that road, I don't know if you've driven it, but there's a 20-mile-an-hour turn. There's some hairpin turns. And one of the lower ones, there was a truck pulling a fifth wheel with a whole bunch of cars behind it. And I thought, oh, good luck, And I did learn later on that they had closed that road very shortly after I had come home on it. So I was very grateful that I was able to do that, because if that road had been closed, it would have been hard to get home. I think I would have gone down to 129, but that was the only way in and out afterwards. So, so of course, as I drove home, there was no power on anywhere. And when I pulled up, I was glad to see my husband's car was parked outside, and I thought, oh good, he's home. But we have 3 cars. And when I walked inside, we were fortunate in that we had not yet really unpacked. So, so all the picture frames and things had not been put on the walls. And I went into the kitchen. I think we were very fortunate, because Elisa's circle is a circle. And depending upon which way your unit faced, because that's all alluvial riparian slough that this thing was built on, so very, very fluid. Because I had neighbors that lived maybe just like 3 doors down, everything came out of their cupboards. And in our case, it looked like things did more up and down, because our teacups were kind of all upside down, and we hadn't actually picked a stemware set when we got married. So we had 3 sets of stemware, and one piece of each of the sets broke. So then we had 3 sets of 3. But we were very fortunate. We did not lose, there wasn't destruction. Whereas like 3 doors down, somebody's whole hutch just dumped everything on the floor. So, but then I noticed, I went in the garage, and my husband's other car, we have a little British Sunbeam Alpine, was not there. And so I didn't know where he was. And I couldn't do much about it. The phones didn't work, the power was out. So shortly after that, I think he arrived with our dog. It's a convertible, so up they drove, and the first thing out of his mouth was, the Marine Lab has been destroyed. And this was the whole reason we moved to this area. So that was big news. So that night, all of the neighbors who we hadn't met yet were all pretty much out of their house, and Elisa Circle has a grassy oval in the center for kids to play. So people were camped there. They didn't want us staying in our house, because they had all ridden out the earthquake there. And our house wasn't that damaged. We didn't have that much to clean up. So we didn't sleep upstairs, because after the earthquake, the ground just kept moving, and there were so many aftershocks that the idea of having to run down the stairs and outside was kind of silly. So we sort of camped out in the living room. We had a futon sofa, so we just opened it up. And but it was interesting, because the family that lived the next unit over, they were out camping outside, and to soothe their children, the father was playing Spanish lullabies to them. And we all had our doors open. It was very warm. And so he was just sort of serenading everyone into calmness. The little girls next door really wanted us to camp. They just did not want us inside, but we got to meet all of them, and some of our other neighbors. And then we just started eating what was in the fridge because the fridge was not on. And I think the first night, it was pretty much ice cream. Other things in the fridge. And then the next night, we actually had our Coleman stove out, and we just cooked all the stuff that was defrosting. Yeah. So we had very nice meals. Okay. And someone had turned off the gas, precautionary. And so the next morning, the ground just shook all night. In fact, when it stopped is when you'd sort of notice. And the power was out. We lived across the street. Our backyard faced Clifford, and there's a big apartment complex there, and the swimming pool had a soft drinks machine, so it was off, and of course, but that was sort of is the power on beacon. Because when it came on, it was like, that's how we knew, because the soft drink thing had lit up. But the next morning, we decided to go to Moss Landing because my husband told me that they had to evacuate all the critters and move everything because the school had been destroyed. And he had been in a classroom. This was a temporary campus, so not what you see now. And everything shifted like 45 degrees. And our dog was tied up outside near the volleyball court, which liquefied. So he was okay. There were big tanks of oxygen and things in the room where my husband was that were not secured to the wall. So he said that when it started to go, he put these down and then sort of jumped out the sliding glass door. And the president at the time of the school used a wheelchair, so that was interesting for him. So the next morning when we went to help clean, because they were just going to load everything up into moving trucks, they weren't even sure at that point where it was going. That's when we realized, because my husband told me that the Highway 1 bridge through Watsonville had been destroyed. The one between the Green Valley exit and the Riverside exit. It had kind of, so it was sitting over the slough, and it just went boom. So all the pilings were sticking up through the bridge. So it was just gone. So we took Lee Road, which at the time was not flooded, it is now. So we took Lee Road around, and Watsonville, was pretty devastated. And the steeple had fallen off the church, and we just went down to the lab, and just, of course, meeting all the professors and things was a little different because they were just people loading stuff on trucks. And they didn't lose any specimens. The sharks were still sitting there in about this much water, and apparently they were able to store everything somewhere near Spreckles. And they actually had to relocate the campus. So the whole reason we moved to the area was so my husband could go to Moss Landing Marine Labs looking over the ocean. And instead he spent 6-7 years driving to portables down in Salinas, near the chocolate and lettuce processing plant. Right. So that was hard because he wasn't quite what he was expecting. And so that's kind of what happened on the day and the day after.
Yeah. Did you understand the significance when it happened? Did you know that it was
right when it happened? No.
Significant?
I thought, oh, yeah, one of those pesky East Bay earthquakes. But as I said, once I started listening to what had happened and, the enormity of what happened over the hill, I think it would have been much worse if the World Series had not been going on, because everybody was sort of in one spot watching the game start. And the enormity of it, I think when you're in something like that, it's just your normal, even though it is quite something. I mean, later for sure, because I lost my job because of it. My husband didn't even have a job yet. And it was financially just awful for us, because there were times afterwards where we thought we should just give up and go back to what we had been doing before, which we lived in Santa Barbara and Ventura. Not that it was that much easier down there, but it was tough because the company I worked for was a giftware company. So if you can imagine the number of stores that closed, and I was filling in a territory where there already was a sales rep. So I was kind of getting the dregs. It was just because we had moved there for my husband, and I had been working for them in Southern California, and they said, well, we have this. And so right about 3 weeks before Christmas, they said, you can either transfer to Sacramento or we can lay you off. So I was not going to Sacramento, so they laid me off. My husband, in the meantime, he had always worked in custom photography. He used to work for a photography studio in Montrose down in Los Angeles, processing school pictures and camp pictures and things. Mm-hmm. So he knew, and in Santa Barbara, he managed a custom lab after he graduated from UC Santa Barbara. So he just went down to Bay Photo, and they hired him. Mm-hmm. And he spent the Christmas season, if you can imagine, I'm sure some other people have told you. So downtown Santa Cruz was trashed, right. And they had set all these tents up for the stores to use. Mm-hmm. And my husband worked at the Bay Photo downtown, which was still fine. They didn't suffer enough damage to close. But what he did was from like 10 o'clock till, 2 in the morning, he printed Christmas photos downtown. Wow. All by himself, because the downtown was very quiet because all the buildings were gone. And he came home one night and he said, they now have us parking in a place where I can see the tile floor underneath my car, because this used to be a building. And this hexagonal tiles. So he said it was very eerie. Yeah. And strange to be downtown pretty much all alone, because people didn't want to go out. It was still, So that was the enormity for us, was mostly financial. I mean, clearly we knew what was happening in other areas. I mean, Watsonville really took it. All the houses jumped off their foundations, a steeple fell, one person died. I think it is a testament to infrastructure in our country, and we should always fund it, that we really only lost about 65, 67 people in the entire Bay Area. Mm-hmm. You think about what happened, what was destroyed, that is pretty amazing. Yeah. And a lot of it was due, even though the infrastructure at the time wasn't what it is now. Mm-hmm. I think that I know in Aptos, although I didn't live here at the time, I talked to the gentleman who was the fire chief at the time. And Aptos doesn't have a city hall like Scotts Valley. We don't have a government. So he became the central information, and they were sort of in charge of Aptos, because all Aptos has is the Aptos La Selva Fire Department. There's nothing else. So yeah, it was, the enormity of it really hit us financially, because there we were with our first Christmas, and my husband was printing Christmas cards for $6 an hour maybe. Wow. Whereas before he had managed a laboratory, a custom photo lab, and I had no job.
Yeah. So the earthquake impacted you and your family pretty heavily.
Yep. Yeah. Yep. It was very challenging for the whole next year because of what happened.
Were you able to get on your feet eventually?
It took a while. Just at Christmas time, I was in contact with a woman that I had worked with for the same company in Southern California, and she had gotten a job as a sales rep for another company that was looking for sales representation where I lived, in a territory that really hadn't been worked in a while. But that meant I would be an independent contractor, not an employee. So at the time I thought, I gotta eat, I gotta work, this is what I'm doing right now. Right. So I did sign on for that, and I worked the gift shows. And I actually, the territory was so dormant that it took several months, and this territory went from King City and Big Sur all the way to Antioch
Oh, wow.
in the East Bay and up to San Francisco on the peninsula. So it was really big. And that's why I had to drive over Hecker Pass for so long, because you were not allowed to drive over Highway 17 unless you were carpooling with the highway patrol leading the caravans until the road was repaired. And so I drove that pass. And unfortunately, the company was, so if you're a giftware rep and you're an independent contractor, you don't get paid until the rep company gets paid. They don't get paid until the store pays the manufacturer.
Right.
And so even though I was working, I wasn't starting to actually earn any income for a few months.
Wow.
So I was on unemployment, and I just accepted that until I was actually making an income. Mm-hmm. And everything was sort of starting to build. It was not easy. My husband was still at Bayphoto and driving to Salinas to go now to college. And then Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of the following year.
Oh.
And the gas prices jumped to the point where I couldn't afford to work because I wasn't making enough to pay for the gas.
Oh, wow.
Because it just jumped. So I went down to Kelly Temporary Services. I figured, I know they pay every week. I can just go somewhere, get an assignment, get a paycheck. I didn't want to do it, but I used to work for a temp service in Santa Barbara and LA. I used to send out the employees. I wasn't a temp, but I knew how it worked. So I just went in and signed up. And they said, oh, you've actually done this work before. And I said, yes. And they said, would you work here? So I ended up working there.
Wow.
So I actually got a decent paycheck, but it took 9 months.
Yeah.
We did not have health insurance. It was very challenging. It was really hard. My parents helped a little bit. My husband's parents helped a little bit with tuition, but still for many years, very, very lean.
Very challenging. Do you think that the earthquake impacted the Santa Cruz, or in your case, Watsonville community?
Yes. Because a lot of the people in Watsonville did not have, I want to say, secure housing. Mm-hmm. I mean, clearly there were houses there, and the houses that fell off their foundations, they all got put back on again. I know a friend of mine in Santa Cruz, he was a migrant ed teacher at the time, and although he was on a balcony in Live Oak during the earthquake, and yeah, it was very exciting for him, he immediately, as soon as he could, he headed to the migrant camps to make sure everybody who was working in the agriculture, their families, because he knew all the kids. It was really hard. A lot of them had to pick up and go back to Mexico because of the circumstances that were that followed the earthquake. So, I think in Watsonville's case, at the time it seemed horrible, but I think in many ways the community sort of used that as a reset. A little different from Santa Cruz, but I had just moved there 4 days before, so I didn't really know the community that well. And I think that they weren't impacted probably in the same way as Santa Cruz, but because the economics down there are just so much more tenuous and unstable, I think it did probably affect the community mostly, in the work and for families. So, yep.
Do you take any precautions against natural disasters now after your experience?
Some. We were very vigilant for probably the first 10 years. And we made sure there was water in the car. And I think the one thing that I always made sure was that I had a pair of sneakers in my car if I wasn't wearing them. Because when I came home, I was wearing dress shoes. And as soon as I walked in the door, I didn't crunch on anything until I got in the kitchen, but I was, that did happen. And I actually kept shoes by my bed, and we did have an earthquake kit. Because we camped, we had a tent, and we had sleeping bags, and the Coleman stove, and all that. And when, I think we thought of that as sort of our go-to setup. And then in 2002, we bought our house in Seacliff, and that house is only 700 square feet, and it's 4 miles from the epicenter. and we couldn't really see a lot of damage. There was a little bit of a crack here and there next to some plaster where the windows, because that's, after the earthquake, that's how you can tell who sustained damage, because we moved from Lisa Circle to Montebello Drive in 1990, and the only damage we noticed, and we were just moving up the hill, was right around the windows. You would have these little lines in the drywall where things kind of shook a little bit. So we didn't even notice much of that in this house, and we had all the windows replaced. So we do keep a kit. I think I'm always aware of it. I don't probably prepare as well as I used to. We get complacent, but I think we have a sort of a presence of mind of what to do. Like if we were to have a large earthquake, you know, we've talked about quickly texting each other, trying to get a call out to somebody who's not here to just let them know. We keep our landline phone, and I actually have one of those princess phones from the 80s that's not electric, because when the power goes out, you can still use the phone if you have a phone that isn't all bells and whistles. So we still have that. And we should probably prepare more. Yep.
What's it like to reflect on your experience 30 years later?
It's very difficult to think that it happened that long ago, because we were married in 1984, and my husband and I had known each other since 1975. So in our long relationship, it seems like this last part, you know, just went kind of quickly. And I think the earthquake itself, you know, it was a thing that happened, and yet it didn't really personally hurt us as far as other people who lost businesses and friends and things. It also was sort of a reminder of no matter what you do, nature will take care of things, and sometimes you just have to sort of be flexible and roll with whatever circumstances occur.
Is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't covered?
I think it would be wise for everyone to do a little bit of preparation. Even if you just print out the what to do and read it, it creates a presence of mind of, for example, I live rather close to the freeway, and whenever a big truck rolls down my street or on the freeway, the ground moves. And so I always look at my pot rack, because if everything on the pot rack starts to sway, then I know that it's not a truck. And potted plants that shake. Those are the kinds of things you remember. And that's where you sort of check. And we have not had a significant earthquake since that time. We've had a few bumpies. And when we lived in Watsonville, we could feel them a little bit more than where I live now. So, but I do have an app on my phone that I do not do notifications except for this app. And so every time there's an earthquake stronger than I think 5 or 6, it tells me. And it's the only one I check. So,
Is it the USGS app?
No, it's called QuakeViz or something. And it has a map interface, so you can click on it and see where on the planet the earthquakes are. So I used to have it set a little lower, but then it was like, oh my gosh, there's always something going on nearby, over by Hollister. And I had a customer when I was a sales rep who told me that her grandmother loved the earthquakes because she could get new dishes every time.
Silver lining.
I said she doesn't have to wait. She can buy them now. But I think that's the only thing. It's really hard. If you buy insurance for your home and your car, it's almost like there's a reason you do that. And we do not have earthquake insurance. I've talked to my agent about it, and they said it's just not worth what it costs, because FEMA usually has a better program for loans if you really do need it after an earthquake. So, but I think if you're in your car, you should have a gallon of water and good shoes, an emergency kit, a first aid kit, those things, and we have all of those. Good. So it's a good thing anyway, but I think for an earthquake especially, you just don't know where you're going to be when it happens. And if I had not been able to get home, I don't know what I would have done because I didn't know anyone because I had just moved here.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing.